Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is fueled by three goals. One, to explain what executive function is and the role of prefrontal lobes in self-actualization. By translating the research findings from neuroscience, psychology, sociology, and many, many other fields in a meaningful ways so that people can actually appreciate the complexity of it. Number two is to help connect the plight of the current self with the vision of the future self. And the third goal is to help people create a playbook for personal success by mastering executive function with all the tools that our incredible guests bring. One such barrier today we're going to talk about is if you want to better yourself, something encouraging needs to come from within. And however, who's sitting inside? There's a highly critical person sitting inside, and there's a self-critical internal dialogue such as, you're stupid, you're an idiot, you'll never amount to anything, what's wrong with you? That's pretty much my one-line summary is, what's wrong with you? So we need to really rethink if this is the right way to bring upon change, and are we making that tone, tuning out that sound, and is it really tuning down or tuning out the sound, or reprogramming the tape recorder? And that's why it's so critical to understand the research that my guest is going to present. And welcome, this is Dr. Kristin Neff. She is currently an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, conducting the first empirical studies on self-compassion nearly 20 years ago. And this is really important to understand, people. If you ask your grandmother, she probably will say, yes, be nice to yourself and the world. But to empirical study means somebody has to actually measure it. So this is not a small feat. And then in addition to writing numerous academic articles and books and chapters on this topic, she's the author of the book Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. She also she has developed many programs, but along with Dr. Chris Germer, she has developed an empirically supported training program, and that's called Mindful Self-Compassion. And we will be linking a lot of resources that she has created for us, but this is a course I highly recommend. Lately, I've been recommending to my clients, particularly those who need a little TLC when they're alone. And this is really valuable to be with you and Dr. Kristin alone on the computer so that you get the guided instructions that you need. And lastly, she's going to publish a fantastic new book. I can't wait to read that. It's called Fierce Self-Compassion: How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. Excited.
So excited. And I love this. We'll talk about this fierce compassion, and particularly you have addressed it to women. So I can't wait to hear that. So let's begin. Since our podcast is about executive function, which entails this adaptive flexibility, goal-orientedness, intentional focus, and goal-directed persistence. And a lot of these skill sets that require somebody to be in charge, to guide the self into maybe better outcomes for the future self. So you as a psychologist, as a researcher, but when you were younger, as a child and a young adult, when did you discover your knowledge about self, or this ability to reflect upon your strengths and challenges and use specific strategies to get things done? How were you in executive function?
Well, I mean, developmentally, it usually happens sometime in adolescence. And I think I was about average, right? I definitely, I was pretty good, for instance, at studying. I always got good grades. And I think part of that probably is because of good executive function skills in terms of, I was aware when I understood something, when I didn't, when I had to restudy something. But, it's funny. It wasn't really until later. I mean, I mean, it's not quite sure. I was always kind of interested in spirituality. For instance, the book, Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now, was on my coffee table growing up.
I love
So I
that.
suppose I was reflecting on things like mindfulness at a pretty young age. And mindfulness is a little bit different than executive function, although they're closely related. So that was probably all there. But it probably wasn't until I was older, actually, until I discovered self-compassion, that I really understood not just cognitive function or executive function, you might say, but emotion regulation in terms of how are you emotionally relating to yourself, and how is your emotional tenor toward yourself changing your thoughts and behaviors. So, I mean, it was occurring, but I think I wasn't explicitly really aware of the incredible difference it makes. The emotional side of things, the warmth, is warm or cold, harsh, the emotional tenor of the conversation wasn't really something I discovered until later, I would say.
And I think it's so interesting. I love the reference that Ram Dass' book was on your coffee table. So there's definitely a culture of pause and think about things,
Yes.
which can be really a very strong ingredient to promote that. And second thing, as you said, it is not, I guess, it doesn't become that doesn't come into focus until it's a problem. So it sounds like you have had a lot of, you enjoyed the benefits of your naturally developing prefrontal system that allowed you to learn as you engaged with the world.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It was useful, right? It allowed me to get good grades and think well and all those things. But as you know, thinking is useful in some respects, and it causes a lot of suffering in other respects, right?
Exactly.
And so it's like, yeah, it's also a problem, especially if you take everything you think really literally and really seriously. So
since we there's so many things to talk about. There are several different aspects of your work in self-compassion that I'm really looking forward to us exploring. But for starters, I know your postdoctoral work was focused on uncovering the potential downside of the quest for higher self-esteem. And I love this 80s movement that said, let's cultivate self-esteem in children.
Yeah.
But you too have discovered, or rather you came to realization that it's probably not the best idea. So what are the pitfalls that you have uncovered that have emerged from this 80s movement of the pursuit of high self-esteem? And how are self-esteem and self-compassion similar? And how are they different?
Right. So, there was actually a big backlash in psychology, especially social psychology, against seeing self-esteem as a panacea. Now, first of all, just to say, what is self-esteem? If you define it as an evaluation of self-worth, I'm a worthy person, I'm no good, somewhere in between. And we certainly know that it's better to have high self-esteem than low self-esteem, because a lot of psychopathology stems from lack of feelings of worth. Right. So depression, anxiety, in the extreme case, suicidal ideation. But what psychologists were discovering is a lot of the ways people get their sense of self-worth are pretty unhealthy. Right. So for instance, social comparison, people have to feel special and above average, especially in American culture.
Yes.
We need to feel special and above average to feel good about ourselves, which means it sets up this constant social comparison. Is he more successful than I am? Is she prettier than I am? Is she smarter than I am? All those constant comparisons, as we try to feel special and above average, means that we're kind of pitting ourselves in competition with other people. So, for instance, why do little kids start to bully others? Either with relational aggression or actually physical aggression. Part of it is the quest for self-esteem. They're trying to feel more powerful, like the cool kid, by picking on or putting others down. So that bullying behavior, continues into adulthood in sometimes more subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle. So that's a problem. Narcissism is also a problem that stems from the quest for high self-esteem. Some people are so invested in having high self-esteem that they start distorting reality. They see themselves as superior. They can't even entertain any sort of criticism of themselves because it would be just too much to lose their self-esteem. So they start distorting and start to gaslight and all those things, which are a problem. But probably the biggest problem with self-esteem is that it's contingent, typically, not always, right? But it's contingent on success, right? So people are, for women, actually, the number one domain of self-esteem in which we invest our self-esteem is appearance. So you have high self-esteem when you look the way you want to look, and you don't have high self-esteem when you don't look the way you want to look. And because of the standards of beauty are so impossibly high for a woman, it sets up a lot of suffering for a woman. But also other things like approval, how much other people like you. It's not like how much your mother likes you. It's how much other people like you. It's a really kind of poor source of information, but we invest a lot in that. And then also performance, right? Am I doing well at those things that are important to me, whether it's school or sports or work? And so it's kind of a fair weather friend, right? Self-esteem is there for you when you succeed. But what happens when you fail in those things that are important to you? Your self-esteem deserts you. And I was learning all about that in my postdoctoral studies, and I'd been practicing self-compassion, which is not a judgment or an evaluation of worth. It's a way of being kind to yourself, just because you're a flawed human being. It's an intrinsic, unconditional sense of self-worth. All human beings are worthy of a compassionate, kind response. And so when you relate to yourself with kindness and support, it's there especially when you need it. And that's when you fall flat on your face, or you get rejected, or, you're feeling badly about yourself. You can say, well, okay, maybe I didn't succeed at this goal, but just because I failed doesn't mean that I am a failure. It doesn't, damn my sense of worthiness as a person. And that's really where you might say it's a healthy source of self-esteem, because if you have more self-compassion, you're also going to have higher self-esteem, but it's not contingent the way it is for most people.
And thank you for taking the time, because I think many listeners may just have these compartmental notions of things. You somehow have, or you gain self-esteem by almost planting seeds. It's a process of living a life where you have a relationship with your experiences, and you really showcase the difference between how we relate to success versus how we relate to failures. Right. And those who relate to them with equanimity are likely to do better. But I was just going to weave in some recently I kind of read this interesting data about narcissism. The longest study, I think they tracked people between 1982 to 2009, and there's a real surge of a higher responses to questions says, I think I'm a special person, I like to be the center of attention, I have a natural talent for influencing people. So they tend to boast a little bit. But one cute study I thought was so funny was this song lyrics. Over time, they found that the words such as I, me, mine have significantly increased, and we, us, and social have gone down. So I think, so let's talk about self-compassion, and also maybe you can help people understand that self-compassion is not a weakness, because I think there's some warped idea that beating yourself up feels right thing to do. It doesn't feel good, but feels like if I reprimand myself, I'll perform better. So where are we getting it wrong?
Right. So, that used to be the idea with parenting as well, right? That, spare the rod, spoil the child. And what we know from the parenting literature is, you might get your kid to obey, but you're going to really damage that kid in many ways psychologically that are going to be harmful to their success in the long run, right? And so what we know is, authoritative parenting, where you're firm but warm, is actually the most successful type of parenting. And the same with self-compassion, right? So self-compassion isn't like just letting yourself off the hook, just saying, okay, that's fine, I robbed a bank, oh well, it's not mushy, it's not indulgent. So if we care about ourselves, just like a caring parent, we're going to want to achieve our goals, we're going to want to work hard, we're going to want to learn from our mistakes, we're going to want to grow, we're going to stop, we're going to want to change unhealthy behaviors. But we do it because we care, not because we feel we're inadequate as we are. So, it's like the motivation of care as opposed to the motivation of fear. And the research is very clear that it's more effective, right? We have less fear of failure. Because if you know that it's okay if you fail because it doesn't damn your worth as a person, it's like everyone fails. Then when you fail, you can say, okay, well, I failed. Everyone fails. What can I learn from this failure? And so that type of learning orientation actually makes it a lot more easy to succeed because we know that failure is our best teacher. But if we shame ourselves when we fail, we can't actually learn when we're full of shame. So it allows us to learn from our failure. It gives us the grit and determination to try again because, again, we aren't so afraid of failure. Okay, I'll try again. If I fail again, well, I'll just pick myself up again. So it leads to persistence. It leads to grit. It leads to a growth mindset. And it's actually more effective over time. And so, the thing about self-criticism, and it's kind of interesting because I wonder if it relates to your work on executive function, but what it does is it buttresses the illusion of control, right? So we really like to feel that we're in control. And it almost feels better to know I should have gotten it right. And like be mad at yourself for not getting it right, because at least you can cling to the illusion, well, that I could have gotten it right. Perfection is possible if I were just to try a little harder, and open to the reality that sometimes we try our best and we still fail. We do our best. It's not like we have no input into the system. We do, but we certainly aren't in control, and we certainly can't control our outcomes. And that's scary. So for instance, my son is autistic, and I've noticed with a lot of autistic kids, failing or making mistakes is incredibly scary. I mean, it is for everyone, but I can see it just so much more clearly with him. You would think he would be super self-compassionate, being raised by me, and he actually is learning the skills slowly, but his first instinct is self-criticism, because in his mind, that's like, okay, that's the sense of control. He gets mad at himself for making a mistake, and that makes him feel safe because it's scary to think that he forgets things sometimes, like we all do. And so it's almost what self-compassion allows us to do is it allows us to give up the illusion of control at the same time. So I talk about it as, the dance of acceptance and change, or these two sides of self-compassion, fierce and tender self-compassion. Tender self-compassion is like accepting, okay, we aren't in total control. We make mistakes. Stuff happens. This is part of life. Can we open to that without, trying to fight it all the time? But the fierce side of self-compassion is saying, yes, and what can I do to help? It doesn't mean like we give up, but we want to do our best, in the future. So we need both. Just like a parent, we love our kids unconditionally, but we want them to achieve their best. It's both simultaneously.
And I love that, because I think as you have talked about this, you have written about this, is that it's about merely being kind to yourself. And kind doesn't mean loose and lack of expectations or permissiveness. Kind means tolerating the mishap in between as you're molding yourself to become a different person. And this is lifelong quest. You're going to continue to change until you die.
Yeah, right. And then you really change once you die. It'll be radically different.
So, this reminds me of my work, working with people on the spectrum and ADHD and people with the mild traumatic brain injury, the concept of friendship making, that how do we find commonality and relate kindly, tolerate the talk that's coming your way, but also share interest and kind of have something common to do. Except here in self-compassion world, making friends is with self. And so I came across this interesting research that talked about almost 25% when asked that when they're suffering or when they're in pain, they report to have no one to talk to. So obviously self-compassion can be so valuable, because in those lonely moments, the one friend that you can rely on is self. So could you tell us a little bit about, is that a right way to think about self-compassion, is learning a mechanism of making friendship with self? And is there any benefit in that approach?
Yeah, well, so that's primary. If you go to my website, it is self-compassion is treating yourself like a good friend. I mean, the friendship metaphor is the most easily understandable, right? Because it's something we know how to be supportive towards, to someone if they're struggling. We know how to be kind. We know how to be warm. Having said that, so self-compassion is more than kindness. You might say that's kind of the core of it. That's really the heart of it, the thing that's easiest to access, to understand. So if we talk to kids, for instance, I just talk about being a good friend to yourself. But kindness alone doesn't necessarily guarantee you good outcomes, because in some ways you could say a narcissist is kind to themselves, right?
Yes.
So but it's true. It's like kindness alone, it's essential, it's the core, but it's not enough. So in my model, there's actually 3 components of self-compassion, and all 3 need to be there to make it a stable and healthy mindset. And they tend to correlate and go together, but not necessarily. So in addition to kindness, first of all, mindfulness is really essential to self-compassion. So mindfulness allows us to see clearly what's happening. And so first of all, the first thing we need to notice is that we're suffering or that we're struggling. And you might think that's obvious, but we often aren't mindful of our suffering. We're doing one of 2 things. Either we're avoiding it and suppressing it, not a problem, or we're so busy, we just aren't even thinking about it. Like if you had a friend, you said, hey, I need to talk, you're struggling, like I'm too busy. We do that with ourselves. I'm just too busy. Or the other thing we do is we get lost in the pain. We get lost in the drama. So there's no perspective. And we need some perspective to step outside of ourselves to say, hey, you're really having a hard time. Can I help? Right? And so mindfulness is what provides us that perspective. And again, that perspective is crucial for us to be able to see clearly what's happening, not to fool ourselves. Like, it's not like positive thinking, like, everything's great. With mindfulness isn't necessarily positive thinking, because mindfulness, actually, things aren't so great. Maybe you need a little work here, a constructive criticism, right? There are some issues that need to be addressed. That mindfulness is what gives us the clarity to be able to do that. And then really important is a sense of common humanity, right? So compassion, by definition, is a connected way of approaching suffering, right? So as opposed to pity, which is like feeling sorry for someone or feeling sorry for oneself, the word in Latin, com, means with, to suffer with. It's like inherently connected.
I love that.
That's why you would like it, Sushita, if I had compassion for you, because like, hey, I've been there. But you wouldn't like if I pitied you. It's like, oh, I feel sorry for you. Right?
Yes.
It's night and day in terms of the feeling, and also night and day in the terms of how we approach ourselves.
Yes.
So we're framing it, again, it's kind of that larger perspective. It's not actually, even though it's called self-compassion, I once had a Buddhist monk say to me, oh, you just mean inner compassion. Like, you don't need a self with self-compassion. In other words, it's just compassion directed inwardly and outwardly. But in many ways, the sense of self recedes in self-compassion, because it's not about me. It's about, oh, this is the human experience. Everyone's imperfect. Everyone struggles. I'm not in total control of things. What's happening is tied to so many complex causes and conditions that are way beyond my ability to, control what's happening. And so, and that the research shows that as well, that people are less self-focused. I mean, self-criticism and shame are incredibly self-focused states of mind. And when you counter that with self-compassion, you're actually less self-focused.
I love that. Can I share a story? It reminded me of a story.
Yes.
Of course, in all traditions have these stories to illustrate the point, but there was a beautiful, a young monk goes to the master and says, well, what is compassion? So he says, come with me and stand here by the window. And from the window, they can see a beggar who's sitting on the street and begging. And an old lady passes by and she throws a gold coin in his lap. And then a few minutes later, a merchant walks by and throws 5 coins in his lap. And then a little boy goes by and the beggar gives him a flower. And so then the master turns to the student and says, who do you think is most compassionate? So the student says, the merchant. And he says, no, son, you're wrong. And so then he says, the old lady who threw the coin, she pitied the beggar, and pity is not compassion. And then and he says, the 5 gold coins, it may look like he was very generous, but he actually was running. There was the government had come to take taxes. So he wanted to escape that. So he threw that. And the beggar, in his misery, he was able to understand the need of the child. And so he is the most compassionate. So it just kind of, I think in your, and I would love for you to maybe comment on the because it may be lost sometimes on people when you use the term our suffering, because suffering sounds dramatic, but suffering is not what dramatic as you mean. It actually is a good way to, it's a psychological term, but can you comment to talk about that?
Yeah, no, it's true. And some people, and I usually try to remind people that I don't necessarily mean it that way, but sometimes suffering is like, big suffering. I mean, stubbing your toe, any moment of emotional discomfort or pain, right? Some big, some small. But the idea is to relate to any sort of negative or difficult or challenging experience, physical pain, mental pain, with the supportive stance. I mean, think about it, stubbing your toe, if you just, it may be a small thing, but oftentimes small things explode into big things because we ignore them, or we just, get mad at people, or yell and kick the dog or something like that. So the idea is it's just a mindset toward any sort of difficulty or negative emotion or challenge. It's really a way we hold pain, again, big or small. Do we hold it with a feeling of connectedness, of kindness, of support? Are we mindful of that? And when we aren't mindful of it, or we get lost in it, or we ignore it, that's when it starts going off to the races, getting out of control.
So, I see your framework so running parallel to the framework of understanding executive function. So if you talk about mindfulness, which is that executive attention, which is knowing, not only paying attention, but knowing what to pay attention to, and continuously monitoring paying off that attention. And one of the lovely things, I think, in the mindfulness literature, as well as your work, you talk about this paying attention to your suffering is kind of taking and dedicating some attention inward, so that the emotions that it generates doesn't take away your capacity to think or feel in a less or more handicapped way. So executive attention, so when we talk about executive attention training, is really heightening the awareness of where the attentional resources are going.
Right. And so that's why a lot of people think of self-compassion as an emotion regulation strategy. I mean, this part,
but that's not fully though, because you have the humanity concept. That is that same, taking mindfulness concept from the Eastern world. There's a whole culture that's
right. Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's more than that, but it is part of it in terms of how it functions and why it's good for well-being. I do think it's because it allows. So when you're emotionally dysregulated, it derails your ability to have useful executive function.
Yes.
Right. And so when you're more emotionally regulated, you're more able to have successful executive function. So the link, again, it's more than that, but
some part of it. Yeah, you're absolutely right, because you're also talking about, which is executive control is trying to control attention. That's not what we're talking about. That is actually becoming this person who's always present, which is not in executive function arena more often people talk about, which needs to be if you want to really improve your attentional awareness. The second part that I really love in your 3-part framework is the common humanity. And one question I had about that, it is this capacity to take perspective and being able to explore the idea beyond one's own suffering, that everybody has suffering, which means the theory of mind concept, that if this happens to me, somebody slights me or insults me, my feelings get hurt, or somebody leaves a bad comment or texts me in a rude way, it's the same reaction any person who is texted rudely to. and I think that forgetfulness is actually a problem with people who have inflexibility, cognitive inflexibility, affective inflexibility, and a lot of disorders, including autism spectrum and ADHD, have deficits in that. So I was just curious. In your work, is this capacity to take perspective of the other, particularly when you're down, normatively easy for people to do? Or if it's even a question that makes sense? How do we think about that?
I think we haven't, I certainly haven't studied it in that type of detail. I think it'd be really interesting to do so. I mean, I do think that perspective taking skills are very useful for self-compassion. imagining what someone kind would say to you about this, or again, imagining what you would say to someone else. Most people don't do it automatically. I'm not sure. I mean, it could be partly because they have poor executive function skills. I think it actually, personally, I think a bigger problem is because when we fail or make a mistake or things are difficult, we go into threat defense mode, right? And then we're activated. So our sympathetic nervous system is activated. And I think again, my gut tells me it's more that the emotions derail us, which inhibits our ability to use these skills, as opposed necessarily to theory of mind. But it's interesting. I'm trying to think about my son. So my son, Rowan, who's autistic, right? He's like most autistic people, he's a lot of challenges with theory of mind. Very hard for him to just figure out what other people must be feeling through the normal ways that, people normally develop, neurotypical people develop earlier. But he's very warm and loving, right? So it's like, he's not going to figure out that you're upset about something, that you're probably upset about something. But if you say, he'll really care about it. So for instance, theory of mind doesn't necessarily mean you care. Con artists have great theory of mind skills.
Absolutely.
Take that to, take advantage of you. So they are different. The warmth and the concern is different from the perspective taking in the theory of mind. And so, so Rowan, he does struggle. He's like for years and years and years, he said, give me that self-compassion stuff, mommy. But it was mainly because he didn't want to accept the pain. He found the pain so scary and so distasteful that he still believed that he could figure it out and like control it and make it go away. And I would say that was probably a bigger block than his difficulty taking the perspective of another, although it probably added into it. So it's, again, that's the thing. So there's the cognitive component, which is you think of as executive function or theory of mind, but then there's also the emotional
affective.
Component. And they're both, and they interact as well.
And it's interesting you say that because we have had an amazing guest on my podcast who has talked about whose work is in this two types of theory of mind, four actually, if you think about it, because one is affective theory of mind, the thinking about and feeling the feelings others feel, and then the cognitive theory of mind, which is thinking of other people's thinking and feelings. So there's two buckets, but then there's interaffective theory of mind between people and then within self. So in that framework, you definitely see deficits in some parts of it, and depending on that neuroatypical developmental pattern. And so that's why you gave such a beautiful example of particularly on autism. A person with autism may not be able to explain that you are, or understand like the complexity of that got you there, but they can meet you there and offer you comfort that really is what humans do to each other. But they may not be able to verbally guide you to think differently about what you got hurt about. So it's a really complicated thing for them.
It is
to be
very complicated. Yeah.
So, this interesting, then can we talk the other side of compassion, which is cruelty, and because you talk about this recognizing humanity, is cruelty more coming from inability to recognize the humanity, or is unwillingness to recognize because it benefits self? It could be both, of course, but what are your thoughts about the role of cruelty, and why this F to F, the not having face-to-face interaction, particularly on the internet, when you leave comments, you see the more cruel side of people. What is happening there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like
so many things.
I think it's not a million miles away from what happens internally. It's like we dehumanize people, right?
Yeah.
So when we're feeling the humanity of ourselves or other people, we naturally tend to be kinder, right? When we're feeling connected to someone we care about. But when we aren't feeling their humanity, we tend to, we take our negative emotions out on them. right? Some people try to exploit others or abuse them. I mean, what's really interesting is most people, if you get their scores, a self-report score of their compassion levels, they're like 4.5 out of 5.0. I mean, most people are off the charts in terms of compassion for others. And then you look at the world, right? It's actually not very compassionate. And so I think there's a lot of, I mean, some of that social desirability bias, but also I think some of it's context, like we're compassionate to some people that we relate to.
In group. Yeah. People.
Yeah. And we aren't compassionate to others, that we kind of call others with the other side of the political spectrum, or, they aren't part of my life. So I'm just not really going to think about them. Yeah. It's complicated. I wouldn't presume to be able to say I had a really good answer for that. But one thing I do know is that self-compassion, actually, because of the ability of self-compassion to hold all the difficult stuff like anger and shame and, insecurity and greed and all these things that drive a lot of these negative social interactions, the more self-compassion we have, the more we're able to have compassionate relationships with others. Sorry. So it's not the case that we must be self-compassionate before we're compassionate to others, because in fact, most people are more compassionate to others than themselves. So in fact, the majority of people are a lot more compassionate to others than themselves. So it's not the case that you have to have it, but when you do have it, it actually enables you to sustain being compassionate to others without burning out. It also helps you deal with your own negative emotions in a way that may end up harming others if they aren't processed or dealt with in a healthy manner.
And it's so neat, this conversation about some clever ways to first manage your emotions so that you can come to a place where you can then activate the compassion that you need to feel, and compassion for people who don't deserve it, or who have legitimately hurt you or hurt your people or whatever. I recently came across Natalie Wynn. She is a transgender activist and a YouTube star. And J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter, said something really interesting and unacceptable, if you ask me, about some hateful thoughts towards transgender, and so she did a YouTube video on it, and it was such an interesting pivot. So she said, because Natalie Wynn herself has a great following, she could have just spewed hate and kind of fed into that how people are and lambasted her. She just took her perspective and say, if this is what you were saying, let me give you some more information. So maybe you will understand why you said is probably not what you would have said if you knew this. So it was such a wonderful way to present it. But yes, it did require, and then I later on heard Natalie Wynn's interview, and she said it took a lot to do that.
Yeah.
So, I think lastly, I want to kind of come in the space of morality, and the benefits of compassion are enormous. As your work shows that it's a predictive of well-being. It also is a better alternative than pursuing self-esteem. It is linked with coping and resilience. It leads to healthier behaviors, not just for the sake of outcome, but just living a better, well-lived life.
And relationships.
And relationships. Oh, well, then before we talk about morality, maybe you can help me understand the research in relationship. And I want to give you a cute story, if I may. So my parents, my father was a big fan of China, of fine bone China. And so we would have sets in India, you drink tea and saucer and very, kettle, like very British influence there. And my mother, God forbid, was a little bit not so careful. And so she would chip, and he would get really upset because that was one thing that he really cared about. And so one day she went to her dear friend's house, who also had an even bigger collection and fancier china. And then the wife dropped one of the cups and broke it. And the husband said, "Oh, poor cup. It has to end your life. It was such a sad day for you. But you know what? Thank you for serving us." And then he went on picking up trash and threw it. So my mom came running home and told my husband, my father, you won't believe this is what I witnessed. And she said, ever since I told him that story, he never, ever made a big deal of any glass or cup or mug chipping ever. And that just changed their relationship. Their fights were about not big things. It was about the cup. And then they stopped. So tell us why it's so valuable when you're compassionate towards yourself, not other person. It actually elevates the relationship.
Yeah. So for instance, we did a study with couples long-term, a year or more in a romantic relationship, and people were described by their partners. If the more self-compassionate they were, the more they were described by their partners as being caring, intimate, less controlling. People were more satisfied in relationships when their partners were self-compassionate. And basically what's happening is, well, first of all, if you can meet a lot of your own needs, you aren't so dependent on your partner to meet your needs exactly as you want them met.
Oh, that's
right? You've got more resources yourself to find some, inner ways to be happy or to deal with some of your issues. So you aren't expecting so much of your partner. And so one of the things that happens is you're less controlling, for instance. If you can meet your own needs and you have your own space, you can actually give your partner more space. Another really important thing is it leads to more authenticity in relationships, because when you can accept yourself and your flaws and be kind and supportive to yourself, you can be more authentic, which allows for more intimacy, right? So there's a lot of research showing that the kinder you are to yourself, the more you're able to, like, for instance, be forgiving toward others and take their perspective. So it definitely is good for others as well as oneself.
So I will change my mind and we'll end with, how do we gain self-compassion? And you have wonderful, well, the most recent guided meditation that you have added is my favorite, by the way, which is the fierce compassion.
Oh, really? Wonderful. Yeah, I just added that. Yeah. So
I love that. So tell us what we can do and tell us what's going to be in your new book.
Yeah. So just to say, so my new book is called Fierce Self-Compassion, how women can harness kindness to speak up, claim their power, and thrive. Because there really are these two sides of self-compassion. There's what I like to call the tender side and the fierce side. Both are equally important, and we need both, and they need to be balanced and integrated. So again, the tenderness is more the accepting, soft, gentle, nurturing side. But the fierce side is like the protective side. For instance, you talked about morality. Standing up to injustice is a crucial act of self-compassion. Right. So the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, all the movements toward greater equality, these are acts of self-compassion, and even if you aren't part of the group, like I'm a white person, but what happens to people of color impacts me as well. So it's really all, self and other at some level, that distinction kind of breaks down. So it's all really important part of compassion.
I didn't think about that. That's brilliant.
Drawing our boundaries, saying no, also meeting our own needs. In other words, not just subordinating our needs. Like women especially are raised, people like us if we're self-sacrificing, and they like us when we say yes. And they don't like us so much when we say no. And part of self-compassion is saying, I'm sorry, I'd love to help, but I can't. I'm busy. I'm doing something. This is really important to me. And it's not like it's not selfish. You're prioritizing yourself over others, but people compromise more. It's like, yeah, my needs are important. Your needs are important. And really valuing ourselves in addition to others is really an important part of self-compassion. And then, of course, motivating change, right? Yes. And not just motivating change inside, also in the world, right? So this is like the action, power-oriented side of self-compassion. What am I going to do to be healthier? What am I going to do to change the world so it's not so destructive and oppressive, right? And the reason it's written for women is because gender socialization, basically, first of all, it inhibits everyone. It inhibits those raised as boys. They can't really be tender. They're called names that they're too tender, right? They're called sissies and all these other names. And that really harms boys' ability to use the power of compassion to help regulate their emotions and to heal from wounds and kind of be emotionally intelligent. It really harms men. But for women, of course, they're allowed to be tender and nurturing, but they aren't allowed to be fierce. They aren't allowed to get angry. They aren't allowed to speak up, at least traditionally. Obviously things are changing, but the vestiges of this are still there and still impacting women. And so that's why I wrote this book, especially for women, because nurture, because compassion is part of the female gender role toward others, not toward ourselves. We kind of know compassion. We're kind of compassion experts. So again, we're kind of doing this twist because I like to call it our mama bear energy. Right?
Yes.
We know how to be mama bear. We know how to be fierce for others, to protect our children, right? Or to protect people we love. And that's in us. But it's only allowed to come out in the context of protecting our children. It's we can tap into that same ferocity to help ourselves, to protect ourselves, or to protect our fellow sisters, or, whatever, to protect people in general. And so I have a lot of, it's not just ideas and research, it's also a lot of practices and how you can develop them. Like, so this, for instance, this fierce friend meditation, which is where you imagine it, ideally person who, an ideal figure who combines this tenderness and fierceness. Because again, too much tenderness without enough fierceness is complacency, but too much fierceness without enough tenderness becomes aggression and hostility. So we always need both. And that's the problem. As a society, we're completely out of balance. So it's my small aim to try to help correct some of that balance.
Oh, you're changing lives. That's so beautiful. And this reminds me of true Buddha nature, right? It's a soft front and firm back.
Yes, exactly.
So morally anchored in, anchored in clarity of vision and purpose. And soft is that receptive, open, kind, but not silly or stupid or
but not a doormat, right?
Not a doormat.
Exactly. Yes, idiot compassion, as Trungpa used to say. Yeah,
exactly. Well, as we end, always love to hear what incredible minds like you are reading these days, and what has influenced your thought process over the years.
So, gosh, well, I've been. For my book, I've actually taken a little break of reading because I just finished it. For my book, I was reading a lot of the literature on things like women's anger.
Really?
A great book like, if I'm saying her name right, Soraya Chemaly, Rage Becomes Her. I love that book. Kind of people writing about how the fact that women aren't allowed to harness their anger for good actually harms them, and kind of what makes healthy anger and unhealthy anger. I'm also reading a lot of Bell Hooks, who's a classic writer, but she's a Black feminist social critic who writes, but she's also Buddhist and is all about love. I mean, that's the amazing thing. She kicks ass, but she's so loving. She's like one of my heroes. I love her. So that's probably the stuff. I just got Ethan Kross's Chatter, which I haven't read yet. I haven't had time, but that sounds really interesting. So
I do not know Ethan Kross's. I mean, is it a new book?
Yeah, it's a new book. You should. I'm sure it's all about self-talk. So it's probably really relevant to what you do. You actually may want to have him on your show.
Oh, that would be lovely.
Called Chatter. Yeah, it looks really good. It's. I just haven't had time to read it yet, but it's. I've got it on my table.
You sound like a voracious reader.
Oh well, sometimes I also get tired. When you work on the computer all day and you write, it's like sometimes you just want to like veg out in front of TV. So I do that as well.
I'm sending my compassion for you because you deserve it. That brilliant mind has few more, not children, few more books to birth. So yes, you're waiting for more. Right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to this amazing conversation. Remember to be kind to yourself. And if you haven't already found inspiration, there are tons of guided meditations that Kristin has created for us. So please follow. As I said, my fierce friendship, mindfulness, self-compassion meditation is my favorite. And keep in touch, share if you like what you're hearing, please share, and have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.